What first attracted me to Emmeline? It was the way she smoked. She could get off a moving bus with ease. And you know, she went walking without gloves. She was a thoroughly modern woman.
Growing up in Weston-super-Mare, Emmeline Pethick shocked polite society when she was one of the first young women to ride a bicycle in public. She moved to London to work with slum girls and became a socialist.
I refused Fred at first. He wasn't a socialist, but he converted for me.
When Emmeline married Fred Lawrence in 1901, they both took the surname Pethick Lawrence to demonstrate the equality of their relationship. Theirs was a true partnership, a marriage on equal terms. Largely forgotten today, the Pethick Lawrences were leading figures in the Women's Social and Political Union, fighting for votes for women. The list of visitors to their house here, the mascot in Homewood, reads like a roll call of prominent suffragettes and socialists. As Annie Kenney wrote in her suffragette autobiography, "If these beautiful woods at Leith Hill could have spoken, Scotland Yard would have forestalled many a militant action." The village of Homewood became the unofficial weekend headquarters of the suffragettes. It was Keir Hardie, leader of the Labour Party and its first MP, who introduced Emmeline Pethick Lawrence to Emmeline Pankhurst.
We determined to organise a society of women to demand immediate enfranchisement, not by any means of outworn missionary methods, but through political action. It was October 1903. We voted to call our new society the Women's Social and Political Union. Deeds, not words, were to be our permanent motto.
Mrs. Pankhurst, short of funds and with no staff, was struggling to set up a London base for her WSPU. Emmeline Pethick Lawrence was initially not very keen to get involved with what she described as Mrs. Pankhurst's pathetic little committee.
To tell the truth, I had no fancy to be drawn into a small group of brave and reckless and quite hopeless people who were prepared to dash themselves against the oldest tradition of human civilization, as well as one of the strongest governments of modern times.
However, she was persuaded to take the vital role of treasurer, and Christabel Pankhurst later recalled that it was a great day when Mrs. Pethick Lawrence joined.
The Pankhursts did not understand organisation, and they had no idea of finance. Theirs was a guerrilla method of political warfare. It became my business to give their genius a solid foundation.
Fred and Emmeline's flat at Clement's Inn in London became the national headquarters of the WSPU. And in 1906, Christabel Pankhurst came to live with them. She stayed with them for 5 years, and together they ran the WSPU from London and from here in Homewood. Fred paid off the organisation's debts, whilst Emmeline sorted out its finances and recruited staff and supporters. In 1907, Fred and Emmeline launched the magazine Votes for Women, which sold 40,000 copies a week during the height of its popularity. Emmeline also organised pageants and processions, including the spectacular Hyde Park demonstration of 1908.
This movement absolutely absorbs me and gives me all I need and all I ever dreamed possible of inspiration and joy.
When such demonstrations failed, the suffragettes chained themselves to the railings and tried to force their way into Parliament. In October 1906, Emmeline Pethick Lawrence was arrested for disorderly conduct for trying to make a speech in the lobby of the Houses of Parliament. She was sentenced to 2 months in Holloway. It was the first of 6 spells of imprisonment. Fred was not able to join the organisation, but nevertheless he played a vital role. In 6 years, he stood bail for over 1,000 women with his own money and became affectionately known as Godfather. In 1912, the WSPU campaign became increasingly militant. On the 1st of March, suffragettes broke 270 windows in central London, and a few days later, Fred, Emmeline and Mrs. Pankhurst were arrested on a charge of conspiracy. Speaking on the eve of the trial, Emmeline said,
"This cause is the purpose for which we were born."
It is good that we shall have by our side Mrs. Pankhurst, who is our friend, who of all women in the world we would wish to have with us in that hour.
The trial generated much sympathy for the trio, and despite the feeling that they had no option but to convict, the jury requested that the judge take into account their undoubtedly pure motives. All three were sentenced to 9 months. It was about this time that suffragettes began to go on hunger strike and endured forced feeding. Women suffered broken teeth, bruised faces, food in the lungs, and infections from dirty equipment. Women left prison weak and physically and mentally abused. Fred and Emmeline were no exception, as Mrs. Pankhurst later recalled.
A sudden scream from Mrs. Lawrence's cell, then the sound of a prolonged and violent struggle. And I knew that they had come to carry their brutal business to our doors. She is a strong woman and a very determined one, and it had required the united strength of 9 wardresses to overcome her. As it was, she resisted so violently that the doctors could not apply the stethoscope, and they had great difficulty in getting the tube down.
The mascot became a place of refuge for these women, and Fred and Emmeline used Votes for Women to praise their heroism. Despite their generosity, hard work and the hardship that they had endured, in October 1912, Fred and Emmeline were informed by Mrs. Pankhurst that their association with the WSPU was at an end. It has always been believed that the Pethick Lawrences and the Pankhursts fell out because Fred and Emmeline opposed the movement's increasing militancy.
Since personal dissensions have never been dwelt upon in the WSPU, I shall not say any more about this important dissension than was announced in the Suffragette and Votes for Women. At the first reunion of the leaders, Mrs. Pankhurst and Miss Christabel Pankhurst outlined a new militant policy, which Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence found themselves altogether unable to approve. Mrs. Pankhurst and Miss Christabel Pankhurst indicated that they were not prepared to modify their intentions and recommended that Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence should leave the Women's Social and Political Union.
But that was not the case.
We shall continue to be jointly responsible with you in the future as we have been in the past. We will fight until victory is won.
We have never, for a single instant, allowed our individual interests to stand in the way of any necessary action, and we never shall.
The likely cause of the split was instead Fred's wealth.
So long as Mr. Lawrence can be connected with the movement's actions, the government will make him pay. They see Mr. Lawrence as a potent weapon against the movement, and they mean to use it. If we raised a fund to recoup Mr. Lawrence, it would mean that our members' money would go finally into the coffers of the enemy, and the fighting fund would be depleted or ended.
On their release from prison, Fred and Mrs. Pankhurst were ordered to pay the costs of the prosecution. However, Mrs. Pankhurst had no assets, and so the Director of Public Prosecutions pursued Fred. When Fred refused to pay, saying that he'd staked his health and his life for the cause and was not about to back down, the contents of the mascot were put up for auction. In response, the suffragettes organised a campaign of open-air rallies and meetings in village halls in Dorking and the surrounding villages. The campaign was run from a house in Howard Road, and the organisers had to reassure worried shopkeepers that there would be no window breaking in Dorking. On the day of the auction, the 31st of October 1912, hundreds of supporters dressed in suffragette colours gathered here in the garden of the mascot.
The warfare between us and the government has now been carried on to the financial plane, and the only course consistent with my principles is to fight every inch of the way.
You may be bidding for my treasured possessions, but there is a greater prize at stake: liberty.
Many of the items bought were handed back to the couple at the end of the auction, and Emmeline had this plaque installed in the hallway of the mascot in commemoration. The auction was a triumph for the WSPU, and it further enhanced Fred and Emmeline's reputations, but it also marked the end of their association with the Pankhursts.
The Suffragettes surged up into my life. They invaded my flat and almost took possession of it and everything in it. They engrossed the attention of my wife, who had become their honorary treasurer, and they brought with them an inexhaustible fund of logic and laughter, courage, charm, reason, and raillery.
If the arrival of the Suffragettes into the lives of the Pethick Lawrences was sudden and dramatic, so too was their departure.
The break was final and complete. From that moment on, I never heard from Mrs. Pankhurst again. And Christabel, who had shared our family life, became a complete stranger.
Fred and Emmeline continued to fight for the vote for women, and when in 1928 the vote was granted to women on equal terms with men, it was Emmeline who led the speeches. Both Fred and Emmeline continued to devote their lives to the causes of equality, peace and socialism. Emmeline was instrumental in the formation of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. As Secretary of State for India in Attlee's post-war Labour government, Fred helped to negotiate Indian independence. On Fred's death, Attlee said that it was given to few men to play a key role in two great campaigns of liberation. While celebrating the 1928 Equal Franchise Act, Emmeline recalled, "We have fought a good fight."
And to those of you who think, oh, here you are, in at the end, I respond, no. I'm in at the beginning.